August 6, 1945. 28-year-old Dr. Shuntaro Hida is lying on a futon in a farmhouse outside Hiroshima. He's exhausted. The night before, an elderly farmer walked 6 kilometers to the military hospital where Hida worked, begging him to come treat his sick grandson in Hisaka village. Hida almost said no. He had a full day of patients waiting back in the city. But something he never could explain what made him stay the night. That decision saved his life. At 8:14 in the morning, Hida steps outside. The sky is clear. It's already hot. He looks up and sees a tiny silver speck, so small it looks like a drop of water suspended in the blue. A Boeing B-29 bomber, 6 miles above him. And then the world ends. The flash hits first. Hida's eyes go blind. He told interviewers 60 years later he could still see it when he closed his eyes, a light brighter than 1,000 suns, burning through his eyelids, turning his vision white. Then the heat, 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a wall of fire traveling at the speed of light. He throws himself to the ground, covering his face, certain he's about to die. 6 miles away, in downtown Hiroshima, the temperature at ground level reaches 7,000 degrees. That's hot enough to melt stone. Hot enough that some people don't burn. They vaporize. The only trace they ever existed shadows burned into concrete, walls where their bodies blocked the light for a fraction of a second. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. It detonated 1,900 feet above a clinic at exactly 8:16 and 2 seconds in the morning. Between 60,000 and 140,000 people died before noon that day. But Dr. Hida didn't know any of that yet. He was lying on the floor of a farmhouse, ears ringing, temporarily blinded, trying to understand what just happened. To understand what he experienced, we need to rewind 12 hours. To a tiny island called Tinian, 1,500 miles south. At 2:45 in the morning, a B-29 bomber designated number 82 takes off into the darkness. The pilot is Colonel Paul Tibbets. He's named the plane after his mother. The Enola Gay, in the bomb bay, a weapon called Little Boy, 10,000 pounds, 4 tons of uranium-235, compressed into a package roughly the size of a trash can. Here's what's remarkable. Most of the crew doesn't know what they're carrying. They've been told it's a special bomb, nothing more. The Manhattan Project was so secretive that the men who would deliver the world's first nuclear weapon into combat didn't know it existed until they were already in the air. At 8:09 a.m., the weather reconnaissance plane radios back. Cloud cover less than 3/10. Advise bomb primary. Tibbets flips on the intercom. It's Hiroshima. At 8:15 and 15 seconds, Bombardier Major Thomas Farabee opens the bomb bay doors. Bomb away, Little Boy drops. The Enola Gay suddenly rises 10 feet 9,700 pounds of weight, just vanished. Tibbets immediately throws the plane into a sharp 155-degree turn, diving hard to get distance. They'd calculated they needed to be at least 8 miles away when the bomb detonated, or the shock wave would tear the plane apart. 43 seconds. That's how long it took to fall 6 miles. 43 seconds to change the world forever. The co-pilot, Captain Robert Lewis, was sitting in the seat behind Tibbets when the bomb detonated. There's been debate for 80 years about what he said in that moment. His flight log, written during the return trip, contains the famous line, "My God, what have we done?" But other crew members told a different story. The navigator, sitting right next to Lewis, said what he actually heard was, "Look at that son of a bitch go." On the ground, Dr. Hida slowly gets to his feet. The city is gone. From 6 kilometers away, he can see a mushroom cloud rising 9 miles into the sky. Everything below it homes, hospitals, schools, temples, 250,000 people, hidden beneath smoke and fire. Hida starts walking toward the city. He's a military doctor. That's where the wounded will be. What he finds is beyond comprehension. People walking like ghosts, skin hanging from their arms in sheets. A mother clutching a baby, both burned beyond recognition, both still alive. Thousands trapped in collapsed buildings, screaming as fires spread and merge into a firestorm that consumes everything. Hida later testified that he couldn't begin treating patients for 3 days. 3 days. Because there were too many dying and not enough supplies, and the heat was so intense the bodies started decomposing immediately in the August sun. When he finally could start treating survivors, he discovered something new. Something no doctor had ever seen before. Fevers above 104 degrees, vomiting, hair falling out in clumps, bleeding from the gums, the eyes, the nose. People who had seemed fine 3 days earlier, suddenly collapsing and dying. He thought his thermometers were broken. He didn't know what radiation poisoning looked like. Nobody did. August 9th. 3 days later, a second B-29, this one called, boxcar takes off from Tinian carrying a plutonium bomb nicknamed Fat Man. The primary target is a city called Kokura, but clouds obscure the target. At the last second, a hole opens in the clouds over the secondary target, Nagasaki. 11:02 in the morning. 40,000 people killed instantly. Another 50,000 dead within 4 months. 2 cities, 9 days. Over 200,000 dead. But here's what almost nobody talks about. While Hiroshima burned, while the world reeled from the revelation of atomic weapons, Allied forces were cataloging something else. Something that had been hidden in the Polish countryside for years. Camps, dozens of them. Liberated in the spring of 1945, just months before the bombs fell. When Soviet soldiers opened the gates at a place called Auschwitz in January, they found something so incomprehensible that General Eisenhower ordered every camera crew in Europe to document it, because he knew people wouldn't believe it existed. The atomic bomb showed the world what humanity could destroy. But the camps were about to reveal what humanity was capable of doing to itself. And the number of dead would dwarf even Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. January 27th, 1945. Eastern Poland. Temperature below freezing. A Soviet cavalry scout from the 100th Rifle Division approaches a cluster of buildings near a town called Oswiecim. He'd been told it was a labor camp, maybe a prison. The Germans had been running it since 1940. But as he gets closer, he realizes something is wrong. The place is massive. Electrified fences stretching for miles. Guard towers. Railway tracks leading directly inside. And the smell. Even in the frozen winter air, there's a smell he can't identify. The Germans called it Konzentrationslager Auschwitz. The world would just call it Auschwitz. At 3 p.m., soldiers from the 322nd Rifle Division enter the main camp. What they find is beyond comprehension. 7,000 people. Most of them can barely stand. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms, staring through barbed wire with hollow eyes. Soviet war correspondent Boris Polovoy wrote for Pravda, "I saw thousands of tortured people whom the Red Army had saved. People so thin they swayed like branches in the wind, people whose ages one could not possibly guess. In the warehouses, they find 370,000 men's suits, 837,000 articles of women's clothing, 7 tons of human hair." A Polish prisoner named Wanda Dromiska later recalled the moment. "We noticed silhouettes of white-clad men walking towards the camp. We were not sure who they were. We even feared it might be the Germans who wanted to eliminate us. Immediately there were shouts, Zdravstvuyte, Tovarishi, hello, comrades. The Soviet soldiers told us not to be afraid, because Germansovnet, the Germans are gone." Lieutenant Yuri Alinsky described what he saw. Snow had already covered them. And then a group of those who were shot, men, women, children. Children behind the wires. A whole crowd of children, from tiny 2 or 3-year-olds to teenagers. Skinny, ragged, sick, hungry. We gave them everything that was in our backpacks. Auschwitz wasn't alone. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, they started finding camps everywhere. April 12th. American troops liberate Buchenwald. 18,000 survivors. April 15th. British forces enter Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. What they find defies belief. 60,000 prisoners crammed into a space designed for 10,000. Thousands of corpses lying in piles throughout the camp, decomposing in the spring heat. The British soldiers weren't combat troops. They were from the 63rd Anti-Tank Regiment and the 11th Armored Division. Nothing in their training prepared them for this. April 29th, Sunday. American infantry divisions reached Dachau, just outside Munich. The 42nd Infantry, the 45th Infantry, and the 20th Armored Division converge on the camp at the same time. 32,000 prisoners inside. But here's what haunts the liberators. The week before liberation, the SS forced 7,000 prisoners, mostly Jews, on a death march south toward Tegernsee. Anyone who couldn't keep walking was shot on the roadside. They were trying to destroy the evidence. And the evidence was people. April 12, 1945. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, visits a camp called Ohrdruf in Germany. It's the first concentration camp he sees personally. He later wrote that he had never been so angry in his life. Immediately, he issues an order. Every camera crew in the European theater is to document these camps. Every soldier within driving distance is to tour them. Members of Congress, British Parliament, newspaper editors, everyone who can bear witness must see this. On April 19th, 1 week later, Eisenhower writes to General George Marshall, "Conditions of indescribable horror prevail." When reporters later question whether publishing photographs of the camps was wise, Eisenhower responds, "I think people ought to know about such things." And then he says something remarkable. He says he's documenting everything because he knows. He knows that someday people will deny this happened, and there needs to be evidence. So much evidence that denial becomes impossible. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany systematically murdered 6 million Jews, about 2.7 million in 6 major extermination camps: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka. Another 150,000 in the broader concentration camp network. At least 800,000 in ghettos across Eastern Europe. Yad Vashem Israel's Memorial to Holocaust Victims has collected 4.8 million names. Individual people, with families, with lives. When the camps opened in the spring of 1945, the world saw what industrial-scale murder looked like. But while Allied leaders photographed the camps and prepared for war crimes trials, something else was happening across Europe. Something that would displace more people than any event in human history. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Churchill, Stalin, and Truman sat at a table with photographs from the camps in front of them. And they made decisions. They redrew borders. They moved entire nations. They authorized what they called orderly and humane transfers of population. 12 million people were about to be forced from their homes. And the word, orderly, turned out to be a lie. In one border town alone, 14,400 people crossed every single day for months. Most were given 30 minutes to pack. Some weren't even given that. July 1946, the Czech-German border. Herta Müller stands in a line stretching for miles. She's 64 years old. Behind her, a suitcase containing everything she's been allowed to keep. 50 pounds. That's the limit. 30 minutes ago, Czech soldiers came to her door in the Sudetenland, the town where she was born, where her parents were born, where her grandparents farmed the same land for generations. They told her she has to leave. Now, she looks behind her. 14,399 other people, all being expelled on this single day. Tomorrow, there will be 14,400 more. The Potsdam Conference called it an orderly and humane transfer of population. There was nothing orderly about it, and there was nothing humane. This is the story of the largest forced migration in human history. 12 million people moved in less than 3 years. And it started with a handshake between 3 men sitting at a table in Germany. July 17th, 1945. Potsdam, just outside Berlin. Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Harry Truman meet for the last major conference of World War II. The war in Europe ended 2 months ago. Japan will surrender in 3 weeks, but Europe is broken. Borders are unclear. Millions of people are in the wrong country, and everyone wants revenge. The big three make a decision. Germany will be reduced, its eastern territories given to Poland, and the German populations living there, millions of them, will be removed. The official language in the Potsdam Agreement is careful, clinical. The 3 governments recognize that the transfer of German populations, or elements thereof, remaining in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, will have to be undertaken. Transfer. That's the word they use. Not expulsion, not deportation. Transfer. As if moving 12 million human beings was like moving furniture. Poland's borders are redrawn completely. The country literally moves west by 200 kilometers. In the east, Stalin takes what was eastern Poland cities like Lwów and Wilno, home to millions of ethnic Poles, and absorbs them into the Soviet Union. 1.5 million Poles are forced to leave. Everything they own gone. Their homes now part of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania. Where do they go? West, to the territories that Germany just lost. Cities that until 3 months ago were German Breslau, Stettin, Danzig, are now Polish. Wrocław, Szczecin, Gask. Between 3 and 4 million Germans are expelled from these areas between 1945 and 1947, forced out to make room for the Poles being forced in from the east. It's a cascade of displacement. Everyone moving. No one wants to move. But Czechoslovakia is where it gets brutal. Before the war, 3.3 million ethnic Germans lived in the Sudetenland, the border regions of Czechoslovakia. They'd been there for 700 years. After Munich in 1938, when Hitler annexed the Sudetenland, many of these Germans welcomed the Nazis. Some joined the Wehrmacht. Some joined the SS. When the war ended, Czechoslovakia wanted them gone. All of them. The official expulsions don't start until January 1946, but the unofficial ones begin immediately. May 30th, 1945. The war in Europe has been over for 22 days. The city of Braunau, called Brunn in German, still has about 30,000 ethnic Germans living there, working in factories, living in apartments, trying to stay invisible. The Provincial National Committee issues Order Number 78, immediate expulsion of all non-working German population, women, children, men over 60. At 6 p.m. on May 30th, police and armed factory workers start going door to door. They're using food ration cards marked with a D for Deutsch, German, the same system the Nazis used to categorize people by race. Around 10 p.m., the first groups start marching. 55 kilometers, 34 miles, to the Austrian border. 18,072 people, mostly women and children, forced to walk through the night with whatever they can carry. It becomes known as the Brno Death March. What happens along the route is disputed. Czech sources say 1,700 to 2,000 died. German sources claim over 5,000. What's not disputed? Hundreds died from exhaustion, dehydration, violence. Many were elderly. Many were children. And this was before the official expulsions even started. January 25th, 1946. The organized transfers begin. The ones approved at Potsdam. The orderly ones. Roughly 1.3 million ethnic Germans are expelled from Czechoslovakia over the next 10 months. The trains leave daily, packed beyond capacity, people crammed into cattle cars. No food, no water, no toilets. At the peak, 14,400 people per day are processed through a single border checkpoint, every single day, for months. Gudrun Lindhardt was 4 years old. She remembers hunger. She remembers her grandmother disappearing. She remembers living in a camp for 8 months, watching children starve. Ute, another survivor, remembers May 1945. The men of her town, about 1,000 of them ordered to the main square, marched 15 kilometers to Postelberg. 800 were shot, buried in mass graves. Her father survived. Her 16-year-old brother escaped, but they were separated, sent to forced labor camps. Her family didn't see each other again for over a year. The death toll from the expulsions is one of the most disputed numbers in modern European history. In 1958, West Germany claimed 2.2 million Germans died during the flight and expulsions from all Eastern European countries combined. When German records were declassified in 1987, historians revised that number dramatically. The German Church Search Service confirmed 473,000 deaths. The German Historical Museum puts it at 600,000. But even the lowest estimates mean this. More people died in the expulsions than died in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. And unlike Hiroshima, this took years. From 1944 to 1950, an estimated 12 to 14 million Germans were expelled or fled from Eastern Europe, from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia. It was the largest forced population movement in human history. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Those empty homes, those abandoned apartments, those destroyed cities that the expelled Germans left behind. Somebody had to rebuild them. Somebody had to reimagine what a city could be when 90% of it was rubble. And what they built wouldn't look anything like what came before. The architects who redesigned Europe after 1945 didn't just clear debris. They cleared the past. They built the future in concrete and steel and radical new visions. And the cities that rose from the ashes would define what Europe looked like for the next 80 years. February 1946, Dresden, Germany. Hans Scharoun stands in the ruins of what was once the Florence of the Elbe. Around him, nothing but broken stone and ash. 90% of the city center destroyed. The firebombing 13 months ago killed 25,000 people in a single night. But Scharoun isn't looking at what was. He's sketching what could be. He's one of 816 people who will submit proposals to a competition called Das Neue Dresden, the New Dresden. Not Rebuild Dresden, New Dresden. The difference matters. Across Europe, in the spring of 1945, cities faced a choice. Rebuild what was destroyed, brick by brick, exactly as it looked before. Or use the rubble as a foundation for something completely different. Most chose different. And that decision would change the face of Europe forever. Let's start with the rubble itself. Because before anyone could build anything, they had to clear millions of tons of debris. Berlin, May 1945. The war ended 6 days ago. 40 million cubic meters of rubble fill the streets. That's enough to build a wall 3 meters high and 1 meter thick stretching from Berlin to Munich. 400 kilometers of broken buildings. The men are gone. 15 million German soldiers missing, dead, or in prisoner of war camps. So the women pick up the hammers. They become known as the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Gertrude Kubitza was one of them. She remembers working until 1959. 14 years of clearing debris. With her bare hands. We had no hammers, No shovels, no buckets, no gloves. Another woman named Na recalled decades later. I wonder sometimes today how my hands are still even working. I look at them and can't believe there is skin still on them at all. Berlin mobilized 60,000 women. They formed human chains, passing bricks hand to hand. They used sledgehammers to break down unsafe walls. They salvaged everything that could be reused, because there was no choice. Germany had no money, no resources, no materials to import. Everything had to come from the ruins themselves. It was estimated at one point that clearing Berlin's rubble would take 42,000 women working continuously for 25 years. They finished faster, because they had no alternative. But while they cleared, architects were arguing about what should replace what they removed. November 1944. France creates the Ministère de la Reconstruction et de l'Urbanisme, the Ministry of Reconstruction and Urban Planning. The MRU, its job, oversee the rebuilding of 452,000 buildings completely destroyed across France. Another 1.4 million partially destroyed. 5 million people homeless. The MRU makes a revolutionary decision. It will control who rebuilds what. Landowners cannot simply reconstruct their own property. The state will choose the architects. The state will approve the plans. And in May 1946, the MRU issues guidelines. Modern urban planning rules, without stylistic requirements, but with a clear direction. Functionality over tradition, the future over the past. Le Havre, a port city on the English Channel in Normandy, 80% destroyed by Allied bombing. The MRU appoints Auguste Perret as chief architect. He's 68 years old, a pioneer of reinforced concrete, and he has a vision. From 1945 to 1964, Perret and his team rebuilt 150 hectares of the city center, not as it was, as it could be. Wide boulevards, uniform building heights, concrete, glass, geometric precision. A grid system that erases the medieval street pattern that existed for centuries. Some residents hate it. They wanted their old city back, the narrow streets, the half-timber-bird houses, the church spires. Perret gives them concrete towers and rational planning, but the MRU backs him, because this is the new philosophy. Cities must be modern, efficient, designed for cars and industry in the 20th century. Not nostalgia. Dresden faces the same debate, but with higher stakes. February 1946. The city announces the competition. Das Neue Dresden. Anyone can submit. Professionals, amateurs, experts and laymen, the announcement says. 816 people respond. The prize money, 100,000 Reichsmark. Funded by the city of Dresden and the Saxony regional government. Among the submissions, Herbert Kohnert's plan. The winner, he proposes something radical but measured. A reconstruction plan that organically and moderately unites the inherited, which is worth preserving. He wants to keep some of the old street layout, honor some of the historic buildings, but modernize the infrastructure. Widen roads, create green spaces, build for the future while respecting the past. It's a compromise between tradition and modernity. But Kohnert dies in June 1946, 1 month before the exhibition opening on July 20th. And after his death, the political winds shift. Walter Weidauer becomes mayor in autumn 1946. He has different ideas, more radical, less concerned with preserving the past. The debate intensifies. What does Dresden owe to its history? What does it owe to the future? Meanwhile, 200 kilometers north, Warsaw makes the opposite choice. Warsaw, 1945. 85% of the city destroyed. The old town, the medieval heart, completely leveled. The Nazis systematically demolished it after the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. Most European cities chose modernism. Warsaw chooses memory. February 14th, 1945. The Warsaw Reconstruction Office is established. 4 years later, in 1949, the government makes the final decision. They will rebuild the old town, exactly as it was, stone by stone, street by street, using old paintings, old photographs, architectural drawings from the 18th century, even paintings by Canaletto from the 1700s showing Warsaw's skyline. By 1953, the Old Town Market Square reopens. 4 years. An entire medieval quarter reconstructed from memory. How? The Social Fund for the Reconstruction of the Capital City. Compulsory taxation on all working people. Special taxes on certain products. Fundraising. Volunteer labor. Communist propaganda called it the whole nation rebuilding its capital. And technically, they were right. Everyone paid for it, whether they wanted to or not. But Warsaw's decision was unusual. Across the rest of Europe, tradition was losing. Modernism promised efficiency, hygiene, progress, rational planning. Buildings designed by science, not sentiment. The MRU in France. The Ministry of Construction in East Germany. The planning boards in Britain, rebuilding London, Coventry, Plymouth. They all push the same direction. Modern materials, modern techniques, modern aesthetics, concrete, steel, glass, functionality. The architect Le Corbusier had been advocating for this since the 1920s. The house is a machine for living in, he wrote. After 1945, people listened, because the old way had failed. The old cities had burned. The old systems had produced war and destruction. Maybe the thinking went, a new architecture could create a new society, but the human cost was invisible at the time. In Brest, France, the MRU expropriated landowners, redefined plots. House owners who previously owned entire buildings were allocated one flat in a new complex, their property taken, their homes replaced with something they didn't choose, all in the name of modern urban planning. In East Germany, the 16 principles of socialist urbanism dictated reconstruction. Architecture became ideology. Buildings had to reflect socialist values. Traditional craftsmanship was dismissed as bourgeois nostalgia. And in cities across Europe, the physical landscape changed so dramatically that when refugees and displaced persons finally returned years later, they couldn't recognize home. The streets were different. The buildings were concrete where wood once stood. The city centers were open plazas where dense neighborhoods used to be. They'd been expelled from their homes. And when some finally came back, the homes no longer existed. Even the ruins were gone. But while architects redesigned cities, world leaders were redesigning something bigger, the entire global system, the rules of international order, the structure of power itself. And unlike the buildings, which took decades to complete, the New World Order was built in weeks by 50 nations in one room in the summer of 1945. And what they created would define the next 80 years. April 25, 1945. San Francisco, California. 850 delegates from 50 nations walk into the War Memorial Opera House. Outside, the war is still happening. Berlin will fall in 5 days. Japan won't surrender for another 3.5 months. But inside this room, they're not planning how to end the war. They're planning what comes after. 9 weeks later, they will walk out having created something that has never existed before. A global organization with the power to prevent war. Or at least, that's the idea. They call it the United Nations. But the meeting almost doesn't happen. Because one of the most important countries, one of the first to be invaded by Nazi Germany, doesn't have a seat. Poland's chair is empty. The problem is simple. There are 2 Polish governments, one in London, one in Moscow. The government in exile in London has been recognized by Britain and the United States since 1939. They've been fighting the Nazis from the beginning. They signed the Declaration by United Nations back in January 1942. But Stalin has a different government. The provisional government based in Lublin, later Warsaw, controlled by the Soviets, installed as the Red Army pushed west. At the Yalta Conference 2 months earlier, in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin tried to solve this. They agreed Poland would form a new united government, combining both sides. It hasn't happened. So when the San Francisco Conference opens on April 25th, there's no Polish delegation. Britain and America refused to seat the Soviet-backed government. The Soviets refused to allow the London exiles. The steering committee makes an unusual decision. They leave a blank space in the charter, right where Poland's signature should go. They'll fill it in later, when someone figures out which Poland is the real Poland. It takes until October 15th, 5 months after the conference ends. The Provisional Government of National Unity finally forms in June. The United States and Britain recognize it in July. And on October 15th, Foreign Minister Winston Yersimovsky signs the charter in Washington. Poland becomes a founding member of the United Nations without ever attending the founding conference. It's the first sign of what's coming, the cracks in the alliance, the beginning of the Cold War. But in April, in San Francisco, the delegates try to ignore the tension. They have work to do. The basic framework already exists. It was drafted at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. the previous year, August to October 1944. Delegates from the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China spent weeks hammering out the structure. A General Assembly where every nation gets one vote. An Executive Security Council with 5 permanent members. An International Court of Justice. But the San Francisco Conference has to turn that blueprint into a functioning system. And immediately, they hit the biggest fight. The veto. The Security Council will have 5 permanent members. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, China, and 11 rotating members elected by the General Assembly. That number will increase to 15 in 1965. The permanent members get a privilege no one else has. The power to veto any substantive resolution. One vote can kill anything. The smaller nations hate it. Delegates from Australia, the Netherlands, Mexico, and dozens of other countries argue this violates the principle of sovereign equality. It creates a hierarchy. Victor's justice. Why should 5 nations have the power to block the will of everyone else? Senator Tom Connolly from the United States delegation stands up during one session. He holds a copy of the charter in his hands, and then he tears it in half. You may go home from San Francisco if you wish, he tells the smaller nations, and report that you have defeated the veto. He throws the torn pages on the table. But you can also say, we tore up the charter. The message is clear. It's the veto or nothing. The Big Five will not join without it. Francis Wilcox, an advisor to the U.S. delegation, later described the moment. It was either the charter with the veto or no charter at all. Stalin's position is identical. At Yalta, he told Roosevelt and Churchill the veto is essential, not just to protect Soviet interests, but to preserve great power unity. The aim, Stalin said, is to avoid divergences among the great powers and create an organization that would keep the peace for at least 50 years. The irony is obvious. The veto is designed to maintain unity, but it will become the tool that paralyzes the Security Council for decades. By 1950, the Soviet Union will have cast 107 vetoes. After 1970, the United States will use it more than anyone, primarily to block resolutions related to Israel. But in June 1945, the delegates don't know that yet. On June 25th, the charter is unanimously adopted at the San Francisco Opera House. The next day, June 26th, it's signed at the Herbst Theater Auditorium in the Veterans War Memorial. 50 nations, one document. 63,000 words. But the United Nations doesn't officially exist yet. The charter has to be ratified. October 24th, 1945. China, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, and a majority of the other signatories have ratified the charter. The United Nations comes into existence. The date becomes United Nations Day, still celebrated every year. But while the UN is being created, another transformation is already complete, one that affects every person on Earth, whether they know it or not. The dollar becomes the center of the global economy. July 1st to 22nd, 1944. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 nations meet for the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. They're here to design a new international financial system. The old system is dead. The gold standard collapsed during the Great Depression. Currencies have been floating, unstable, chaotic. Trade is crippled. They need a new anchor. The British delegation, led by economist John Maynard Keynes, proposes a new international currency called the Bancor, a neutral reserve currency not tied to any single nation. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, has a different idea: the dollar. At this point in history, the United States holds 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Its economy is the only major industrial power not destroyed by war. Its factories are intact. Its infrastructure undamaged. The dollar is the only currency stable enough to anchor the system. On July 13th, during a meeting of Commission 1, Ardashir Darabshah Shroff from the Indian delegation asks Harry Dexter White a question. I think it is high time that the USA delegation give us a definition of gold and gold convertible exchange. Dennis Robertson, a British economist, responds the next day. He proposes that payments should be expressed in official holdings of gold and United States dollars. It's not a mistake. The next day, he confirms the language. Gold and United States dollars. The dollar, almost by accident, becomes the world's reserve currency. The agreement: the United States will buy gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies will peg their value to the dollar. The dollar is pegged to gold. It creates stability, predictability, a system where international trade can function. It also creates American economic dominance that will last for decades. Until 1971, when President Nixon ends the gold convertibility. But that's 26 years away. In 1944, Bretton Woods also creates two institutions: the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank. Their job: stabilize currencies, provide loans, rebuild war-torn economies. Together, the UN and Bretton Woods create a new global architecture, political and economic. But there's a third pillar, one built not in a conference hall, but in a palace in Crimea. February 4 to 11, 1945, Yalta. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin meet at the Levadia Palace. The war in Europe has 3 months left. The war in the Pacific, 6 months. They're dividing the world. Germany will be split into 4 occupation zones. The United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union each control one. Berlin, even though it's 100 miles inside the Soviet zone, will also be divided into 4 sectors. Poland's borders will move west. The Soviet Union takes eastern Poland. Poland gets eastern Germany as compensation. Millions of people displaced as a result. Stalin agrees to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In exchange, the Soviet Union gets back territories lost in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Influence in Manchuria. Control of southern Sakhalin Island. And then there's the unwritten part. The part Churchill and Stalin discussed in Moscow the previous October. The percentages agreement. Churchill scribbled on a piece of paper: Romania, 90% Soviet influence. Greece, 90% British influence. Yugoslavia, 50-50. Hungary, 50-50. Bulgaria, 75% Soviet. Stalin looked at it, took a blue pencil, put a check mark. Churchill later called it his naughty document. It wasn't a formal agreement. It wasn't written into any treaty, but it reflected reality. Where the Red Army stood, Soviet influence would dominate. Where British and American forces stood, Western influence would prevail. At Yalta, Roosevelt is dying. He has 2 months to live. He's exhausted. He wants agreements. He wants the war over. He doesn't want to argue about what happens after. Churchill is more suspicious. He distrusts Stalin, but Britain is bankrupt. Its empire is crumbling. It can't challenge the Soviet Union alone. Stalin knows this. He knows the Red Army occupies Eastern Europe. He knows possession is 9/10 of the law. He agrees to free and unfettered elections in Poland. He agrees to a declaration on liberated Europe promising democratic governments. He has no intention of keeping those promises. By 1948, every country in Eastern Europe occupied by Soviet forces will have a communist government. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Churchill will write to Roosevelt after Yalta. The Soviet Union has become a danger to the free world. But in February 1945, they're still allies, still signing agreements, still smiling for photographs. The world that emerges from these 3 events, San Francisco, Bretton Woods, Yalta, will define the next 70 years. A United Nations unable to act when the great powers disagree. A dollar-based financial system that makes America the center of global trade. And a Europe divided between East and West by an iron curtain. But while diplomats drew lines on maps and signed treaties, something else was happening in laboratories and military facilities across the United States. Scientists were building machines, developing technologies, creating tools that would change everything. And unlike the political agreements, which were built on compromise and negotiation, the technology was absolute. It worked, or it didn't. There was no middle ground. And what they built in the final days of the war would define the next 8 decades of human progress. Bell Telephone Laboratories, Murray Hill, New Jersey. April 1945. The war in Europe has 2 weeks left. But physicist William Shockley isn't thinking about Berlin. He's thinking about semiconductors. He walks into the office of Mervyn Kelly, the director of research at Bell Labs, with a proposal. Build a solid-state amplifier. Something smaller than a vacuum tube, more reliable, more efficient. Something that could change everything. Kelly had already been thinking about this. During the war, Bell Labs worked on radar systems, crystal rectifiers, microwave technology. All of it funded by military contracts. All of it classified. But now the war is ending. And Kelly wants to redirect that expertise towards something civilian, something commercial. He approves Shockley's proposal. He creates a new research group. Shockley will lead it, along with chemist Stanley Morgan. They hire 2 more people, Walter Bertain, an experimental physicist, and a new recruit, a theoretical physicist named John Bardeen. Their goal: create a transistor, a solid-state device that can amplify electrical signals without the fragility and heat of vacuum tubes. They don't know it yet, but what they're about to invent will become the foundation of every computer, every smartphone, every digital device for the next 80 years. But in April 1945, it's just 4 men in a lab with an idea. 2.5 years later, on December 16th, 1947, Bardeen and Bertain will achieve it. The first working point contact transistor, amplifying a signal through a germanium semiconductor. Shockley, bitter that his own design didn't work first, will spend the next 4 years developing the superior junction transistor. He'll succeed in 1951. All three will win the Nobel Prize in 1956. But the work starts in 1945, funded by wartime research money, built on knowledge gained from radar development, pushed forward by a government that understood technology wins wars. And Bell Labs wasn't the only place building the future. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Moore School of Electrical Engineering, University of Pennsylvania, December 10th, 1945, 4 months after Japan surrendered. A room the size of a small house. 40 panels, 9 feet tall, stretching around 3 walls. 18,000 vacuum tubes. 10,000 capacitors. 6,000 switches. 70,000 resistors. It hums. It radiates heat. It consumes 160 kilowatts of power. It's called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer God. And today, for the first time, it's running a real calculation. The U.S. Army funded it. $150,000. Started in June 1943. The goal: calculate artillery firing tables faster than human computers. Calculating one ballistic's trajectory took a person 40 hours. By hand, with mechanical calculators. The Army needed thousands of these calculations for different guns, different angles, different weather conditions. So physicist John Mauchly and engineer J. Presper Eckert proposed building an electronic calculator. Digital, programmable. Nobody had done it before. It took 2 years to build. The war ended before it was finished. Too late for ballistics tables. But Los Alamos had a different problem. They just built 2 atomic bombs. 1 uranium, 1 plutonium, dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now they wanted to build something bigger. A hydrogen bomb. A thermonuclear weapon thousands of times more powerful. But the physics are complicated. The calculations enormous. On December 10th, 1945, physicists from Los Alamos arrive at the Moore School. They load their secret problem onto ENIAC. 6 women operated. Kay McNulty, Betty Jennings, Betty Snyder, Marlon Weskoff, Fran Bilas, and Ruth Lichterman. They'd been hired as computers, the term for people who did calculations. Now they're programmers, the world's first. The calculation runs. ENIAC works. What it calculated remains classified. But it almost certainly involved ignition physics for the hydrogen bomb. The war created ENIAC, but the Cold War would make it essential. Within 5 years, the U.S. Army, the Navy, and the newly created Atomic Energy Commission would fund dozens of computer projects. MANIAC at Los Alamos. Computers at Argonne National Laboratory. Oak Ridge National Laboratory. IBM would develop ferrite core memories funded by the National Security Agency. They'd build the Stretch supercomputer for Los Alamos, starting in 1956. Every major advance in computing for the next 2 decades would be driven by nuclear weapons research. But computers weren't the only technology transformed by war. September 1940, Birmingham, England. Physicists John Randall and Harry Boot are working on a problem. Radar works, but it's massive. Room-sized transmitters. Long wavelength signals that can't detect small objects. They need microwave radar, 10-centimeter wavelengths, high power, compact enough to fit in an airplane. Existing magnetrons can't do it. Not enough power, not stable enough. Randall and Boot designed something new, a cavity magnetron, a device the size of a small book that can generate kilowatts of microwave power. By February 1940, they have a working prototype. It changes the war. By 1942, Allied aircraft have airborne radar that can detect submarines at night. Ships have surface search radar. Night fighters can find bombers in total darkness that the Germans never catch up. Their radar systems remain inferior for the rest of the war. American historian James Finney Baxter later called the cavity magnetron the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. But here's the thing. After the war, the cavity magnetron doesn't disappear. It gets miniaturized, refined, mass-produced. In 1947, British cavity magnetrons are adapted for industrial use, heating, drying, processing materials. And in 1945, a Raytheon engineer named Percy Spencer is working with a magnetron when he notices the chocolate bar in his pocket has melted. He experiments. Popcorn kernels, an egg, both cook when exposed to microwave radiation. Raytheon files a patent in 1945. The first microwave oven. It won't be commercially viable until the 1960s. But the technology exists in 1945, a direct descendant of wartime radar. And then there are the jet engines. October 1944. Germany. The Messerschmitt Me-262 becomes operational with the Luftwaffe. It's the world's first operational jet fighter. Twin Jumo 004 engines. Top speed over 500 miles per hour. The Allies have nothing that fast, but they're working on it. Frank Whittle, a British engineer, had been developing jet engines since the 1930s. His WW2 700 engine powered the Gloucester Meteor, which entered service with the RAF in July 1944. In America, General Electric built engines based on Whittle's designs. The Bell P-59 Aerocomet flew in October 1942. By the end of the war, jet technology existed, but it was experimental, unreliable, fuel inefficient. After the war, everything changes. Republic Aviation starts developing the P-84 Thunderjet in 1944. It uses an axial flow engine more efficient, more streamlined than the centrifugal designs used during the war. It flies for the first time in January 1946. By the Korean War. It's the premier American fighter bomber. And by the late 1950s, commercial jet airliners will revolutionize travel. The Boeing 707. The Douglas DC-8. Built on technology refined during World War II. But there's a pattern here. Every single one of these technologies, transistors, computers, radar, jet engines, was funded by the military, developed for war, then adapted for civilian use. And after 1945, that pattern accelerates, because something happens in the summer of 1946 that changes everything. August 1st, 1946. President Harry Truman signs the Atomic Energy Act. It creates the Atomic Energy Commission. The AEC. Its job: develop nuclear weapons, build reactors, research atomic energy. But it also does something else. It becomes the largest funder of scientific research in American history. The AEC builds laboratories. Los Alamos, Argonne, Oak Ridge, Lawrence Livermore. It funds universities, MIT, Stanford. Berkeley. It contracts with private companies. IBM, General Electric, Westinghouse. And it pours money into computing. Because designing nuclear weapons requires calculations that no human can do. No mechanical calculator can handle. You need computers, fast ones, powerful ones. So the AEC funds them. MANIAC in 1952. The IBM 704 in 1955. The Control Data 6600 in 1964. Every generation faster, more capable. And the talent pool expands. Physicists working on weapons design, engineers building supercomputers, mathematicians developing algorithms. When they leave the labs, they take that knowledge with them to universities, to private companies, to startups. The head of IBM's Applied Science Department, Cuthbert Hurd, came directly from Oak Ridge National Laboratory in 1949. The computer industry is born from nuclear weapons research. But it's not just America. August 29, 1949, Semipalatinsk test site, Kazakhstan. The Soviet Union detonates its first atomic bomb. America's nuclear monopoly is over. The arms race begins. Both sides pour resources into weapons development. Hydrogen bombs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear submarines, and every weapon requires better technology. Faster computers, smaller electronics, more reliable guidance systems. The transistor, invented at Bell Labs in 1947, becomes essential. By 1952, the military is buying 90,000 transistors, almost the entire production. In 1958, the Air Force commits to using semiconductors in the Minuteman missile. That single decision creates a guaranteed market for transistor manufacturers. Companies invest, technology improves. By 1960, the military is buying 48% of all semiconductor devices produced in America. Without that guaranteed demand, the transistor industry might never have grown fast enough to become commercially viable. The Cold War didn't just fund technology. It created the market that made technology profitable. And here's the thing nobody talks about. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed over 200,000 people. The Holocaust killed 6 million. But the technologies developed during and immediately after World War II computers, transistors, radar, jet engines have touched the lives of billions. Every smartphone, every GPS system, every airline flight, every medical imaging device, all descendants of machines built while the world was bleeding. In 1945, the world was rubble, cities destroyed, millions dead, millions more displaced. But beneath the devastation, something else was happening. Scientists in laboratories, engineers in factories, researchers funded by governments desperate to win wars. They were building the future, and 80 years later, we're still living in the world they created.